By sunrise in 1912, somewhere outside Ellsworth, Kansas, the brindle bulldog that always met the dawn shift was gone. His chain lay coiled neat by the spigot, clasp still latched, as if someone had unhooked it with care and set it down gentle. The night watchman found damp paw marks climbing the wooden ladder 3 rungs up, and stopping clean in mid-wood. No smear, no slip, just ending where air began. The tank held nothing but silence, and when men in Kansas still talk about that spring, they don't ask what took the dog. They ask what walked up that ladder after him. The place was a rail water stop halfway between Ellsworth and the empty grassland towns that lived and died by the schedule. A wooden tower rose 30 feet, holding a 1,000-gallon tank fed by a windmill pump that creaked in the wind and went silent when the air died. There was a dirt platform for the locomotive tenders, a single steel line heading west, and a small shack where the night watch kept time and trimmed the red signal lamp that glowed like a coal all night. Cattle country stretched flat in all directions, broken only by telegraph poles and scattered thorn fence. Spring nights out there were warm and windless, the kind where sound carried for miles, and the stars pressed so low you felt you could scrape them with your hat. The air tasted of dust and coal grit, and when the wind stopped, you could hear the tank water settle against the timber cribbing like something breathing slow and patient. The watchman's name was Emmett Voiles, 41, steady and known for working alone without complaint. He'd been on the night shift for 6 years. He kept a tin of tobacco, a pocket watch his father gave him before the old man died, and a brindle bulldog named Tiller that rode out with him on the wagon every evening and slept under the ladder during the shift. Tiller was 3 years old, heavy in the chest with a jaw you could trust and eyes that followed Emmett like he was the only thing in the world worth watching. The dog was loyal past reason. If Emmett walked to check the pump or climbed the catwalk to clean the lamp, Tiller followed. If Emmett sat, Tiller sat. If Emmett whistled, Tiller came at a trot, no hesitation. The dog had never run off, never chased a rabbit past the platform, never answered to another man's call. Emmett's wife used to say the dog loved that tank more than he loved home, and she was probably right. She also said Tiller had better sense than most men she knew, and nobody argued. On the night it happened, Emmett clocked in just after 10. The evening freight had come through an hour before, watered and gone. The platform was still damp where the tender hose had dripped, and the air smelled of wet wood and iron. Emmett lit the signal lamp with a match, checked the spigot pressure with his hand on the valve, and settled on the shack step with his tobacco and his watch. Tiller lay at his feet, head on his paws, ears forward, calm. The night was warm and dead still, no train due until past 3. Emmett later said the dog had been fine for the first 2 hours, sleeping, waking to shift position, circling once to scratch, settling again with a sigh. Nothing wrong. Nothing that would make you think. Then, a few minutes before midnight, Tiller lifted his head. Ears forward. No growl. No bark. He stood slow, looked straight toward the timber cribbing at the base of the tower, and walked to it as if someone he trusted had called his name from the shadows. Emmett whistled once, soft, the 2-note sound Tiller always answered to. The dog didn't turn. He didn't even flick an ear. He sat down by the base of the ladder, staring up into the dark scaffolding under the tank where the crossbeams made shadows the lamp couldn't reach, and he stayed there, frozen, like he was waiting for permission. Emmett stood, brushed the tobacco off his trousers and walked over. He looked up into the beams. He saw nothing, just the underside of the tank, the iron straps, the catwalk edge, all the same as it had been for 6 years. He called Tiller's name, quiet and firm. The dog didn't move. Emmett crouched, put his hand on the dog's neck. The fur was warm, the muscle tense. Tiller's eyes stayed fixed upward. Emmett whistled again, louder. Nothing. Emmett stood, uneasy now, and walked back to the shack to fetch his other lantern and a length of rope in case he needed to secure something or pull the dog back if he'd gotten spooked by a rat or a barn owl. When he turned around less than a minute later, Tiller was gone. The chain lay coiled by the spigot in a neat spiral, clasp still shut tight. No sign of a struggle, no scratch marks in the dirt. Emmett called the dog's name, first calm, then louder, then shouting. He walked the platform edge, checked under the shack, circled the base of the tower twice with the lantern swinging wide. No dog. No sound of paws in the dirt. No movement in the grass beyond the rails. The night stayed silent, windless, and wrong. Then he heard it. A single metallic ring, sharp and clear like a boot heel striking the bottom rung of the iron ladder. He spun fast, held the lantern high toward the tower. Nobody stood on the ladder. The platform was empty. The sound didn't repeat. Emmett's chest tightened. He walked to the ladder, touched the bottom rung with his palm. Cold iron, no warmth, no vibration. But when he climbed 3 steps up to check the catwalk level, he found the damp paw prints, 4 clear tracks, front paws and back paws, pressed into the wood grain of the ladder rungs as if Tiller had climbed with wet feet, though the night was dry and the dog's paws had been dusty when Emmett touched him a minute before. The prints ran up the first rung, then the second, then the third, and on the third rung they stopped. Not at the edge where a dog might leap, not smeared where a dog might slip. They stopped clean in the center of the wood, both front paws side by side as if Tiller had simply lifted into the air mid-step and vanished like steam. Emmett climbed higher, boots ringing loud on the iron, swinging the lantern in wide arcs, calling Tiller's name until his voice cracked and his throat burned. The catwalk was empty. The tank hatch was still bolted with the iron pin through the hasp, untouched. He pulled the pin anyway, shoved the hatch open with both hands and leaned over the black rim. He shouted Tiller's name into the water. His voice came back flat and muffled, like the inside of the tank had swallowed the sound and given back something duller. He listened. No splash. No whimper. No scratch of claws on metal. Just the faint lap of water against timber, and a smell like old iron and wet rope. He climbed back down, his hands shaking now, and checked the paw prints again with his fingers. Still damp, still clear. Still stopping in the middle of the third rung with no reason in this world. He crouched there under the ladder for a long time, lantern on the ground beside him, staring at those prints until his knees ached and the stars wheeled overhead. When the 315 westbound freight finally rolled in, the engineer leaned out and asked why Emmett looked so pale and why he was sitting on the ground. Emmett stood, brushed the dust off, and said his dog ran off. The engineer glanced down at the coiled chain by the spigot, the clasp still closed, and said nothing. He watered the locomotive in silence and left. By dawn, Emmett had walked every inch of ground within 200 yards of the tower. He checked the fence line, the grass along the rails, the dirt road back toward town. No paw prints, no blood, no scrap of fur snagged on barbed wire, no sign a dog had passed. He stood under the ladder as the sun came up and watched the damp prints fade slow into the wood grain, and still he couldn't say where Tiller had gone or what had made that iron ladder ring like a boot striking metal when no man stood anywhere near it. Old hands in Kansas still say that if you ask Emmett Voiles what he thinks happened that night, he'll tell you he doesn't know. But he'll also tell you he never took another night shift alone, and he never kept another dog. By mid-morning, Emmett's wife had come out to the tower with their neighbor, a man named Harlan Pritt who kept hogs south of town and had known Tiller since the dog was a pup. Emmett showed them the chain, the clasp, the place where the prints had been. The wood was dry now, but you could still see the faint grain difference where moisture had soaked in. Harlan crouched, ran his thumb over the third rung, and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked if Emmett had checked the grass line past the platform. Emmett said he'd walked it twice. Harlan said they'd walk it again. They spent the rest of that day combing the ground in a wide circle around the water tower, calling Tiller's name, checking under every scrap of brush and every low spot in the prairie where a dog might crawl to die if something had gotten into him. They found nothing. No prints. No disturbed dirt. No sign anything larger than a ground squirrel had moved through that grass in days. By sunset, Harlan's voice was hoarse and Emmett's wife had gone quiet in the way people do when hope starts to bend. They stood together on the platform as the evening freight came through, and the engineer asked if they'd found the dog yet. Emmett shook his head. The engineer said he'd keep an eye out down the line, but his face said he didn't expect to see anything. That night, Emmett worked the shift with Harlan sitting beside him on the shack step, a rifle across his knees in case whatever had taken Tiller came back. The two men didn't talk much. They drank coffee from a tin pot and watched the stars and listened to the windmill creak when the breeze picked up around midnight. At 2:30, they both heard it, a low, rhythmic sound coming from inside the tank, like something breathing slow and deep. Harlan stood, rifle ready, and looked at Emmett. Emmett's face had gone white. They climbed the ladder together, boots ringing loud on the iron, and stood on the catwalk listening. The sound was clearer up there, muffled but steady, coming from behind the bolted hatch. It sounded like a dog sleeping heavy, the way Tiller used to sleep after a long day, chest rising and falling in that deep rhythm you could almost count. Harlan reached for the hatch. Emmett grabbed his wrist. "Don't," Emmett said. Harlan looked at him. Emmett's hand was shaking. They stood there for a full minute, listening to that slow, sleeping breath come through the iron, and then Harlan stepped back, and they climbed down without opening the hatch. Neither man said a word about it until dawn, and when they finally did, Harlan said he didn't think it was Tiller in there, and Emmett said he didn't either, but he couldn't say what it was instead. By the second day, word had spread through Ellsworth. A dozen men came out to help search, some on foot, some on horseback. They brought lanterns, dogs, and long iron rods to probe the brush and the soft ground near the creek that ran a quarter-mile south of the tower. The dogs were eager at first, tails up, noses down, working the scent line Emmett gave them from Tiller's blanket. But when they reached the base of the water tower, every one of them stopped. 3 hounds and a cattle dog, all good workers, all trained to track, and every single one sat down in the dirt and refused to go closer. 2 of them whined. One lay flat and wouldn't stand even when his owner pulled the lead. The men looked at each other. Someone said maybe the dog smelled something dead up in the tank. Someone else said the tank had been checked. Nobody offered another explanation. They searched anyway, spreading out in a line across the grassland, walking shoulder to shoulder, calling Tiller's name every few minutes. They tied strips of white cloth to the fence posts to mark where they'd been, and by afternoon the whole area looked like it had been gridded for surveying. They found nothing. One man found a dry cow bone, bleached white, half buried in the dirt. Another found a rusted horseshoe. That was all. When they came back to the tower to rest and water the horses, one of the younger men said he'd heard a short whistle while he was out past the fence line. 2 notes, like someone calling a dog. He said it came from the direction of the tower, and he'd thought maybe Emmett was signaling them to come back. But Emmett had been standing right there on the platform the whole time, and he hadn't whistled. The young man went quiet. Someone else said sound carries strange out on the flats, and maybe it had come from the rail line or from a train miles off. Nobody looked convinced. That evening, after the search party had gone home, a section foreman named Talbot came by the tower to check the pump mechanism. He was a practical man, 60 years old, who'd worked the railroad since he was 15 and didn't spook easy. Emmett told him about the dog, the prints, the sound in the tank. Talbot listened, chewed his tobacco, and said he'd check the tank himself. He climbed the ladder, unbolted the hatch, and leaned in with a lantern. He stayed up there longer than Emmett expected. When he came back down, his face was tight, and his hands smelled like iron. He said the water was clean, the walls were sound, and there was nothing in there but a dry rag at the bottom that didn't belong. He said he'd pulled it out with a hook. He held it up, a square of cloth, folded neat and sharp as if someone had ironed it flat, smelling of coal oil. Talbot said the tank had been inspected and cleaned 2 weeks prior, and this rag hadn't been there then. He asked Emmett if he'd dropped it. Emmett said no. Talbot folded it again, slow, and set it on the shack step. He said he didn't like it. He didn't say why. The next morning, the telegraph in the shack clicked twice. 2 sharp bursts, no message, just the sound of Emmett's name spelled out in the old rail code. Emmett was alone when it happened. He stood, walked to the key, and waited for the rest of the message. Nothing came. He tapped the key to signal back. The line was dead quiet. He walked into Ellsworth that afternoon and found the operator, a man named Cobb who'd been working the line for 20 years. Cobb said he hadn't sent anything. He checked his log. No outgoing messages to the water stop since the previous Thursday. Emmett asked if the line could have crossed somewhere, picked up a signal from another station. Cobb said it was possible, but not likely. And besides, why would another station send Emmett's name? Emmett didn't answer. He walked back to the tower in the heat, and by the time he got there his mouth tasted like metal, sharp and wrong, like he'd been sucking on a penny. That same week, a boy walking past the tower on his way home from school swore he heard the snoring again, low and steady, coming from inside the tank. He told his older brother. His brother dared him to climb up and knock on the tank wall. The boy did it the next day, scared but stubborn, climbing the ladder slow and rapping his knuckles 3 times on the iron. The snoring stopped. He counted to 10 in his head, heart pounding. And then it started again from a different part of the tank, like whatever was inside had moved along the curve to listen first. The boy climbed down fast and didn't go near the tower again for 2 years. When people asked him later what he thought was in there, he said he didn't know, but it wasn't a dog. By the end of the first week, the older hands around Ellsworth, Kansas, started telling the younger ones that you don't work the night shift alone at the water stop anymore. It wasn't a rule anyone wrote down. It was just understood. When the rail superintendent came through to check on operations, he asked Emmett if he needed a second man on shift. Emmett said yes without explaining why. The superintendent didn't ask. He assigned a young worker named Pruitt to pair up with Emmett, and Pruitt was told on his first night, "Don't climb the ladder alone, don't open the hatch without someone watching, and if you hear something from inside the tank that sounds like breathing, you leave it be." On the 10th day, a farmer named Stokes was riding past the tower just after dawn when he saw something on the catwalk, a blue enamel bowl sitting upright beside the hatch. He knew it hadn't been there the evening before because he'd passed the same way at dusk and the catwalk had been empty. He rode closer, called up to see if anyone was working. No answer. He climbed the ladder, slow, and touched the bowl with his hand. It was warm. Not hot, but warm, like it had been sitting in the sun, though the sun was barely up, and the iron catwalk was still cold enough to frost his breath. He picked it up, turned it over. No markings, just a plain blue enamel dog bowl, the kind you could buy at any mercantile. He climbed down, walked to Emmett's house, and showed it to him. Emmett recognized it immediately. It was Tiller's bowl, the one his wife kept by the back door for water. Emmett walked to the kitchen and found the same bowl sitting in its usual spot, exactly where it had been that morning when he'd left for his shift. His wife was standing right there. She said she hadn't moved it. She said she hadn't been to the tower in weeks. Emmett held both bowls, one in each hand, and they were identical. Same size, same chip on the rim, same weight. He set them on the table side by side and stared at them until his wife asked him to stop. That afternoon, Emmett went to the rail office and told the superintendent he wanted the tower searched again, top to bottom, and he wanted men with him when they did it. The superintendent agreed. They brought 4 men, all with lanterns, and they climbed the tower together in daylight and opened the hatch wide. They lowered a man on a rope into the tank with a lantern tied to his belt. He called up that the water was clean, the walls were solid, and there was nothing inside but timber and rivets. No dog, no bones, no second rag. When they pulled him out, his hands were shaking, and he said the air inside the tank tasted wrong, like metal and smoke, but he couldn't say why. They climbed down and stood in a circle on the platform, and nobody spoke for a long time. Then Talbot, the section foreman, said what they were all thinking. "Something's wrong with this place." He didn't say what. He didn't need to. The men nodded, and one by one they walked back toward town, and none of them looked back at the tower. That night, Emmett and Pruitt worked the shift together, and at midnight they heard it again. The sound of something breathing slow and deep inside the tank, and this time it didn't stop until the sun came up. By the second week, the search had become something else. Not a rescue anymore, but a ritual. A way for the people around Ellsworth, Kansas to prove to themselves they'd done everything a community could do. They walked the grid again, wider this time, stretching past the creek and into the low hills where the grass grew tall and the thorn fence marked the edge of grazing land. They brought more dogs, younger ones, hoping fresh noses might pick up what the others had missed. The new dogs worked hard for the first hour, tails high, pulling at their leads, but when they reached the same spot near the base of the water tower, they balked. One growled low, hackles up, staring at the ladder. Another tucked its tail and backed away until the lead went taut. The handlers looked at each other. Nobody offered an explanation that made sense. The men kept searching. They dragged iron hooks through the shallow drainage ditches on either side of the rail line, thinking maybe Tiller had fallen and drowned, though the water was barely ankle deep. They found nothing but silt and rotted timber. They checked the windmill housing, the pump shed, the crawl space under the shack. They pulled up floorboards. They sifted dirt. They checked inside the coal bunker, a low wooden box no dog could have gotten into without leaving scratches on the latch. It was empty, except for black powder and the smell of creosote. By the third day of that second week, there was nowhere left to walk that didn't already hold their boot prints. And still nobody had found the dog or any piece of evidence that said where he'd gone. On the afternoon of the 15th day, Emmett was alone in the shack, cleaning the lantern glass, when he found the note wedged between the windowsill and the frame. It was folded once, the paper yellowed and soft. He pulled it out, unfolded it, and his chest tightened. The handwriting was his own. The same slant, the same pressure, the same way he looped the tail of his lowercase g. It said, in pencil, "Check the cribbing north side." Emmett stared at it. He hadn't written that note. He was sure of it. He would have remembered. He turned it over. Nothing on the back. The paper was old, but the pencil was fresh, not faded. He folded it again, slow, his hands unsteady, and walked outside to check the north side of the timber cribbing where the tower sat on its wooden foundation. He found nothing. The timbers were solid. No gaps. No scratches. No sign anything had been disturbed. He crouched there in the dirt, the note in his hand, and tried to think. He hadn't written it, but the handwriting was his, exact enough that if someone showed it to him blind, he would have sworn he'd put pencil to paper himself. That evening, he showed the note to Pruitt, the young man working the night shift with him. Pruitt read it, looked at Emmett, and asked if Emmett had written it. Emmett said no. Pruitt turned the note over, held it close to the lamp, and handed it back without another word. His face had gone pale. Later, near midnight, Pruitt said he thought maybe someone was playing a trick. Emmett asked who. Pruitt didn't answer. They both knew no one in Ellsworth would do that. 3 days later, the blue enamel bowl appeared again. This time it was sitting on the shack step, upright and centered, as if someone had placed it with care. Emmett found it just after dusk. It was warm, not hot, but noticeably warm, though the evening air was cool enough that he could see his breath. The warmth wasn't from the sun. The sun had been down for an hour. He looked around. No footprints in the dirt. No wagon tracks. No sign anyone had been near the shack since morning. He picked up the bowl with both hands and carried it inside. When Pruitt arrived, Emmett showed it to him. Pruitt reached out to touch it, hesitated, then pulled his hand back. He asked if it was the same bowl from before. Emmett said he thought so, but he couldn't be sure, because the other one, the one the farmer had found on the catwalk, was still sitting on his kitchen table at home next to the original. 3 bowls now, all identical, all appearing in places they shouldn't be. Pruitt sat down slow, his face tight, and said he didn't want to touch it. Emmett didn't blame him. By the end of that week, theories had started to spread through Ellsworth. Quiet and careful. Some said Emmett had enemies, maybe someone from his past who wanted to drive him off the job or out of his mind. But nobody could name a single person who had reason to hate Emmett Voiles. He was steady, quiet, fair. He didn't gamble, didn't drink heavy, didn't owe money. Others said maybe the dog had gotten sick, wandered off to die the way animals do, and the rest was coincidence. The bowls, the note, the sounds in the tank. But that didn't explain the paw prints stopping in midair, or the handwriting that matched Emmett's so perfectly it could have been traced. A few people whispered something else, something they wouldn't say in full daylight. They said the land out past the thorn fence had always been strange, that cattle wouldn't graze there even in drought, that birds didn't roost in the scrub trees. They said the water tower had been built over a low spot where rainwater used to pool, and that the railroad men who sank the foundation 20 years back had found bones down there. Animal bones, they'd said, though nobody had looked close. One old woman in town, A widow named Ferris, who'd lived in Kansas since before the rail line came through, said the Kansas people used to avoid that stretch of ground. Most people didn't put much weight on stories like that. But the stories didn't stop. A man named Collier, who worked the freight line, said he'd heard the two-note whistle again, the one Emmett used to call Tiller, coming from the direction of the tower at 3:30 in the morning, when no one was supposed to be outside. He said it came clear and sharp, and when he looked out the locomotive window he saw the red signal lamp glowing steady, but no movement on the platform. He didn't stop. He said later he should have, but he didn't. And he couldn't explain why except to say that something about the sound made him want to keep the throttle open and put distance between himself and that tower. Another man, a section worker named Gaines, said he'd been checking for loose spikes when he found a strip of white cloth tied to a fence post, one of the search markers, but this one was tied in a different spot, a spot they'd already searched and marked 2 weeks before, and it was tied in a knot Gaines didn't recognize. Neat, tight, symmetrical. Gaines said he untied it, put it in his pocket, and kept walking. When he got back to the section house that evening and emptied his pockets, the cloth wasn't there. He checked his jacket, his trousers, the tool bag he'd been carrying. Nothing. He said he must have dropped it, but his voice didn't sound sure. After that, the older hands around Ellsworth, Kansas started telling the younger ones outright, "You don't work that tower alone. You don't climb that ladder without someone watching from the ground. You don't open the hatch unless there are 2 of you on the catwalk. And if you hear something inside the tank, breathing, snoring, movement, anything, you leave it be." One foreman put it plain to a new hire. 2 men, never one. That's the rule now. We don't explain it. You just follow it. The new hire asked why. The foreman said, "Because the last dog that worked that tower didn't come back and we'd prefer the same doesn't happen to you." By the end of the 3rd week, Emmett had stopped sleeping well. His wife said he'd wake in the night, sitting up fast, listening for something she couldn't hear. She said he'd started keeping the note in his wallet, folded small, and that once she'd seen him take it out and compare it to his own handwriting in the ledger he kept for household expenses. The 2 samples matched so perfectly she couldn't tell them apart. When she asked him about it, he'd folded the note again and walked outside without answering. On the 21st day, the bull appeared one more time, this time inside the shack, sitting on the table where Emmett kept his tobacco tin and his father's pocket watch. The door had been locked. Emmett had the only key. When he opened the door that evening and saw the bull sitting there, upright and centered, still faintly warm to the touch, he backed out of the shack and stood on the platform for a full 5 minutes before he could make himself go back inside. Pruitt found him standing there staring at the closed door and asked what was wrong. Emmett said, "It's inside." Pruitt asked what he meant. Emmett said, "The bowl. It's inside the shack. The door was locked." They went in together. The bowl was still there. Pruitt touched it, pulled his hand back and said it felt like it had been sitting next to a stove. But there was no stove in the shack. There was no heat source at all except the lantern, and the lantern had been cold when they'd arrived. Pruitt looked at Emmett and said, "We should tell the superintendent." Emmett said, "And say what?" Pruitt didn't answer. They left the bowl on the table and worked the shift in silence, and neither of them went back into the shack alone that night. The next morning, Talbot came by to check the tower. Emmett showed him the bowl, the note. Talbot listened, his face unreadable, and then he said something that stayed with Emmett for the rest of his life. He said, "I've worked the rails for 40 years. I've seen men fall, seen boilers blow, seen track buckle under a full train. I've seen things you can explain and things you can't. This is the kind you don't explain, you just stay clear of it." He picked up the bowl, looked at it for a long time, and set it back down without another word. He told Emmett to box it up along with the note and anything else that didn't belong and to keep the box sealed. He said, "Sometimes things want attention. You stop giving it to them, maybe they'll stop asking." Emmett did as he was told. He put the bowl, the note, and the folded rag Talbot had pulled from the tank into a wooden crate and nailed the lid shut. He stored it in the back of the shack, behind the spare lantern oil, but that night when he and Pruitt arrived for their shift, the crate was open. The nails were still in the wood, driven deep, but the lid was off, leaning against the wall, and the bowl was sitting on the table again, upright and warm. Neither of them touched it. They worked the shift outside on the platform under the stars, and they didn't go back into the shack until the sun came up. By the end of that first month, Emmett Voiles had requested a transfer to a different section of the line. The superintendent approved it without asking questions. A new man named Kepler was assigned to the water stop, paired with Pruitt, and on his first night, Pruitt told him the rules. 2 men, never one. Don't climb the ladder alone. Don't open the hatch unless someone's watching. If you hear something inside the tank, you leave it be. Kepler asked what he might hear. Pruitt said, "You'll know when you hear it." Kepler asked what had happened to the dog. Pruitt said the dog was gone, and that was all anyone needed to know. Kepler didn't ask again. Within 6 months, the story had settled into the bones of Ellsworth, Kansas, the way stories do when they stop being news and start being warning. Mothers told their children not to play near the water tower, not even in daylight. Fathers told their sons that if they ever took work on the rails, they'd follow the rules at that stop without question. The rules were simple, unwritten, and absolute. No one worked the tower alone. No one opened the tank hatch without a witness. No one stayed on the catwalk longer than necessary. And if you found something that didn't belong, a bowl, a note, a piece of cloth, you didn't touch it, you didn't take it home, and you didn't talk about it where the younger children could hear. The water stop kept running. Trains came through, watered, and left. The windmill turned. The red signal lamp burned every night. But the place had changed in a way that couldn't be measured or repaired. Workers who'd been on the line for years started requesting reassignments. New hires lasted a few weeks, then quit without explanation. The rail company had to raise the pay for that stop twice in the first year just to keep it staffed. And even then, men only took the job if they were desperate or too new to know better. The ones who stayed learned fast. They learned to keep their backs to the platform. They learned not to look up at the catwalk after dark. They learned that the sound of something breathing slow and deep inside the tank was not a thing you investigated. It was a thing you ignored, the same way you ignored the creak of the tower in the wind or the rattle of the telegraph wire when a storm was coming. By the second year, the wooden crate Emmett had nailed shut was gone. No one admitted to moving it. It simply wasn't in the shack anymore. Some said the new workers had tossed it, not knowing what was inside. Others said Talbot had taken it and burned it out behind the section house. But a few said the crate had been opened one more time, late at night, and that whatever was inside had been taken back to wherever it came from. No one asked which version was true. It didn't matter. The crate was gone, and that was enough. But the bowl came back. 3 years after Tiller disappeared, a young telegrapher named Marsh was walking the platform just after dawn when he saw it sitting on the shack step, blue enamel, upright, clean. He picked it up without thinking, felt the warmth in his palms, and dropped it fast. It hit the dirt and didn't break, just rolled once and settled. Marsh stared at it, his heart pounding, and then he walked away and didn't come back to the water stop for 2 weeks. When he finally returned, the bowl was gone, but he swore to anyone who'd listened that it had been warm, that it had felt like something alive, and that he'd never touch anything at that tower again unless it was part of his job. 5 years after that, a section foreman doing a routine inspection found the bowl again, this time sitting inside the tank on the catwalk ledge, just inside the open hatch. He climbed down without touching it and reported it to the district supervisor. The supervisor sent 2 men to retrieve it. They climbed the ladder together, looked at the bowl for a long time, and then one of them picked it up with a rag and carried it down. It was warm. They put it in a burlap sack, tied the top, and left it at the section house. The next morning, the sack was empty. The knot was still tied. The bowl was gone. By the time a decade had passed, the story had traveled up and down the rail line, carried by engineers and brakemen and section crews who'd heard it from the men before them. It was told in bunkhouses and station cafes, in the kind of low voices people use when they're not sure who's listening. Some versions said the dog had been killed by a drifter who'd hopped a freight and camped near the tower. Some said the dog had gotten into poison meant for coyotes and crawled into the tank to die, though no one could explain the paw prints or the warm bowls or the note in Emmett's handwriting. Some said the dog had simply run off, spooked by something only animals can sense, and that everything else was coincidence and nerves. But there was another version, one that people in Kansas didn't say out loud unless they were sure of the company, That version said the land under the water tower had always been wrong, that it took things and didn't give them back, and that Tiller hadn't been the first. That version said the paw prints stopped in midair because the dog had been pulled up, not by hands, but by something else, something that could mimic warmth, that could fold cloth and write notes and move objects through locked doors. That version said the bowl kept coming back because whatever had taken the dog wanted people to know it was still there, still watching, still waiting. And that version, the one nobody in Ellsworth dared to speak in full daylight, was the one that explained why the rules at that water stop never changed, why men still doubled up on shifts 40 years later, and why children growing up in Kansas in the 1920s and 1930s were told, without explanation, that they didn't go near that tower alone. Emmett Voiles worked the rails for another 20 years, but he never went back to that water stop. He retired in 1932, moved to a small house on the edge of Ellsworth, and lived quietly until his death in 1947. His wife said he never kept another dog. She said that in the last years of his life, he'd sometimes wake in the middle of the night and walk to the window, staring out toward the rail line as if he were listening for something. She said he never told her what he was listening for, and she never asked. When he died, they found the note still in his wallet, folded small and soft from years of handling. His wife burned it the same day, along with a few other papers, and she never said why. The water tower stood for another 30 years. By the 1950s, diesel locomotives had replaced the old steam engines, and the need for water stops along the line had faded. The tower was decommissioned in 1958, the tank drained, the windmill dismantled. The wooden platform rotted and collapsed. The shack was torn down, the timbers hauled away. The land sat empty for a decade, grown over with prairie grass and thorn scrub, and eventually a farmer bought the plot and used it for grazing. But the cattle wouldn't stay there. They'd graze up to the fence line, then stop and turn back, same as they'd always done. The farmer sold the land a few years later. It changed hands twice more before someone finally built a storage shed on the site in the 1980s. The shed is still there. It's used for equipment now, plows, seeders, rolls of wire. The people who own it don't know what used to stand there, but the old-timers in Ellsworth, Kansas still do. They still talk about Tiller, the brindle bulldog who walked to the base of a water tower one warm night in 1912 and never came back. They talk about the paw prints that stopped in midair, the bowl that appeared warm in 3 places at once, the note in handwriting that couldn't be explained. They talk about the sound of something breathing slow and deep inside a tank that held nothing but water and iron. And when they talk about it, they don't use the word ghost, because that's not the right word for what happened there. They use words like wrong and strange, and the kind of thing you don't mess with. They say the rules at that water stop weren't superstition, they were survival. And they say that whatever took the dog is still out there, somewhere in the flat Kansas grassland, waiting patient in the places where the land doesn't give back what it takes. The bowl appeared one last time in 1963, 20 years after Emmett died. A boy walking the old rail bed found it sitting upright in the dirt where the platform used to be. Blue enamel, clean, and still faintly warm in the cool morning air. He picked it up, carried it home, and showed it to his grandfather. The grandfather recognized it immediately. He took the bowl from the boy's hands, walked back to the site, and left it exactly where the boy had found it. He told the boy they didn't bring things home from that place. He didn't say why. The boy asked what had happened there. The grandfather said, "A long time ago, a good dog went missing, and nobody ever found him." That's all you need to know. The boy asked if the bowl belonged to the dog. The grandfather said yes. The boy asked why they couldn't keep it. The grandfather said, "Because it's not ours to keep." He never explained further. The bowl was gone by the next morning. Which version of this story makes sense to you? The one where a man's enemy drove him off the job with tricks and cruel theater? The one where a dog simply ran off and died and the rest was coincidence? Or the one where something in the land under that tower reached up through the wood and took what it wanted, leaving behind only warmth and impossible objects and the memory of paw prints that stopped in the air? People in Kansas still won't say the third version out loud, not in full daylight, not where their children can hear. But they follow the rules it taught them. They double up on night work, They don't ignore the places animals refuse to go, and they don't ask too many questions about the things that come back warm when they should be cold, or the handwriting that matches too perfectly, or the breathing that comes from inside a tank that holds nothing but water and iron and silence. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.